Emergency broadcasts crackled across every inhabited system in the galaxy, carrying news that would change the course of interstellar civilization forever. The Outer Rim territories had gone completely dark over the past 6 months, with entire colonies vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only empty settlements and signs of systematic hunting. Admiral Rebecca Hayes felt her stomach tighten as she reviewed the reconnaissance data flowing across her command console. The evidence painted a terrifying picture of a previously unknown species that the intelligence analyst had designated as Ravagers. These creatures possessed technology that allowed them to track biological signatures across vast distances, and their hunting patterns revealed a disturbing preference for juvenile members of every intelligent species they encountered. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened within hours of the first confirmed contact reports. Representatives from 47 different species materializing via quantum communication links in the Great Assembly Chamber, orbiting Nexus Station. What they learned from the sole survivor of the Outer Colony massacre sent waves of horror. Through even the most battle-hardened delegates, they don't just kill the young ones. The traumatized Centauri witness testified, his 6 arms trembling as he spoke through the translation matrix. They consume them while they're still alive, absorbing something from their developing minds that makes the Ravagers more intelligent, more cunning with each feeding. The Council's xenobiology experts confirmed the worst fears through analysis of the crime scenes. The Ravagers possessed a unique neural adaptation that allowed them to integrate the cognitive patterns of developing brains into their own consciousness, essentially stealing the potential intelligence of entire generations to enhance their own species' capabilities. As the full scope of the threat became clear, Council Chairman Vortis called for immediate action. Every species with young populations must evacuate their juveniles to secure locations while our combined fleets engage these creatures, he announced, his crystalline form shimmering with urgency. But the Ravagers had already demonstrated their ability to track prey across interstellar distances, making traditional evacuation protocols virtually useless. The only viable solution proposed by the military strategists involved establishing hidden educational colonies on uncharted worlds, staffed by adult volunteers who would protect and educate the young while the main fleets attempted to hunt down the Ravager threat. The silence that followed this proposal stretched for nearly 10 minutes as representatives calculated the implications. Any adult who volunteered for such an assignment would face almost certain death when the Ravagers inevitably discovered these hidden sanctuaries. The architects were the first to respond, their collective voice resonating through the chamber's acoustic systems. Our adult population contains irreplaceable crystalline matrices developed over millennia of accumulated knowledge. We cannot risk such valuable resources on what amounts to a suicide mission. The scholar delegation quickly echoed this sentiment, their telepathic representative explaining that mature minds of their species held the combined wisdom of countless generations. To lose even a few adult scholars would set back our civilization's development by centuries, one by one. Each species representative offered similar explanations for why their adults could not be spared for such a dangerous undertaking. The warrior caste defenders claimed their veterans were needed for direct military engagement with the Ravagers. The aquatic depth dwellers insisted their mature population was required to maintain their underwater cities, and the energy-based luminants argued that their adults were literally irreplaceable components of their planetary infrastructure. As the excuses mounted, a growing sense of desperation filled the chamber. If no species was willing to volunteer, adults for the Guardian colonies, then the Ravager threat would consume an entire generation of galactic youth before any military solution could be implemented. The human delegation had remained silent throughout the debate, their modest representation consisting of only 3 individuals from what most council members considered one of the galaxy's youngest and least significant civilizations. Humanity had joined the galactic community barely 3 centuries ago, possessing no remarkable technologies, no special evolutionary advantages, and no particular expertise beyond basic intelligence and crude kinetic weapons. Captain Anna Mills rose from the human section, her simple uniform contrasting sharply with the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by other species representatives. At 42 years old, she had spent most of her adult life serving in Earth's deep space exploration program. and her weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen both the wonders and dangers of the galaxy firsthand. "We'll take them," she said quietly, her words somehow carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite the lack of any amplification device. The chamber fell silent as delegates turned to stare at the human representative, uncertain they had heard correctly. Chairman Vortis leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting confusion as he asked for clarification. "We'll take all of them," Mills repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Every child from every species that needs protection, send them to us and we'll keep them safe." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of species began speaking at once, their translators creating a cacophony of disbelief and protest. "You cannot possibly accommodate the different environmental needs," the aquatic representative protested. "Some of our young require constant immersion in specific chemical solutions. The atmospheric requirements alone would be impossible to manage," added the silicon-based delegate. "Our juveniles need temperatures that would be lethal to most carbon-based life forms." Mills waited for the objections to subside before responding with a slight smile that somehow conveyed both determination and a touch of that peculiar human optimism that other species found so puzzling. "We'll figure it out. That's what humans do best." The debate that followed lasted for hours as species after species pointed out the logical impossibilities of the human proposal. How could a technologically primitive species manage the complex requirements of dozens of different alien life forms, especially while under constant threat from the most dangerous predators the galaxy had ever encountered? But as the arguments continued, something remarkable began to happen. Human volunteers started appearing in the observer galleries, having somehow learned about the emergency session and made their way to Nexus Station from across human space. Teachers, engineers, doctors, farmers, soldiers, and citizens from every walk of human life filled the available seating, all of them having apparently reached the same conclusion independently. If children needed protection, then humans would provide it, regardless of the cost. By the end of the session, over 10,000 human volunteers had registered for what they were already calling the Guardian Protocol, each one fully aware that they were volunteering for what amounted to a one-way mission to protect children who weren't even their own species. Admiral Hayes watched the proceedings with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, knowing that she was witnessing something that would either save the galaxy's future or mark the end of humanity's brief participation in interstellar civilization. But as she looked at the faces of her fellow humans, she saw no fear or hesitation, only the same stubborn determination that had carried their species through countless challenges throughout their violent evolutionary history. The final vote was unanimous, though several species abstained. The human proposal was accepted, and within days colony ships began departing from Earth carrying volunteers who waved goodbye to their families with smiles that fooled no one about the likelihood of their return. Dr. Sarah Wilson had never expected to spend her retirement years teaching alien children how to read. Yet here she was on the forest moon of Kepler 442c, watching a young Centauri struggle with basic arithmetic while a tiny aerial sprite helped by arranging pebbles into counting patterns with movements so fast they blurred. The transformation of 13 different worlds into functioning educational colonies had taken 8 months of backbreaking work, with human volunteers creating something that galactic civilization had never attempted before. Truly integrated learning environments where species with wildly different physiological and psychological needs could develop together safely. Each morning brought new challenges that would have seemed impossible to solve just a year ago. Wilson's school alone housed 312 children from 47 different species, each requiring unique accommodations that stretched human ingenuity to its absolute limits. The aquatic children needed specially constructed pools, with precise chemical balances that changed daily as they matured, while the silicon-based juveniles required heated chambers that would have killed most carbon-based life forms within minutes. Somehow, the human engineers had managed to create modular habitats that could be reconfigured constantly to meet evolving needs. Former soldier Mike Torres had become the unlikely physical education instructor, devising games that accommodated everything, from the six-armed Centauri to the ethereal luminants who existed as organized energy fields. His military experience had taught him to adapt quickly to impossible situations, but nothing had prepared him for the challenge of creating playground equipment safe for beings who ranged from microscopic to massive. The dietary requirements alone had nearly driven the colony planners to madness. Some species required live prey, others needed specific mineral compounds that had to be synthesized from raw materials, and a few survived entirely on electromagnetic radiation of particular frequencies. Chef Maria Santos had solved this problem through what she called creative chaos, establishing food preparation areas that resembled something between a restaurant, kitchen, and a chemistry laboratory. She had learned to culture dozens of different microorganisms, synthesize complex organic compounds, and even generate controlled electromagnetic fields for the energy-feeding species. But the greatest challenge wasn't physiological adaptation. It was creating educational programs that could accommodate learning styles that had evolved on dozens of different worlds under completely different conditions. Some species learned through direct mental connection, others through repetitive, physical practice, and still others through complex chemical exchanges that humans barely understood. Teacher Susan Park had developed what she called the universal curriculum, using mathematical concepts as a foundation since logical relationships seemed to transcend species barriers. She watched daily as young minds that had evolved under alien suns worked together to solve problems, their different perspectives, creating insights that amazed even the human instructors. The emotional aspects of integration proved equally complex. Many of the alien children had been traumatically separated from their families with little understanding of why. Arriving at the colonies, frightened and confused, child psychologist Dr. Emily Chen had adapted human counseling techniques to work across species lines, learning to read emotional states in beings whose expressions ranged from color changes to electromagnetic fluctuations. She discovered that the fundamental need for security and belonging seemed universal, even among species whose adult forms showed little emotional connection to their offspring. The breakthrough came when the children began teaching each other. Young scholars naturally shared knowledge through telepathic links, helping other species understand complex concepts instantly, while the intuitive empaths could sense emotional distress and offer comfort regardless of species barriers. Wilson watched these interactions with growing amazement, realizing that something unprecedented was happening in their hidden schools. The children weren't just learning academic subjects. They were developing relationships that transcended every barrier that had historically separated galactic civilizations. A young defender child, barely old enough to walk on his powerful hind legs, had appointed himself protector of the fragile. Aerial sprites following them around to ensure no one accidentally stepped on his tiny friends. Meanwhile, the sprites repaid his kindness by using their incredible speed to help him with tasks that his large size made difficult. The mineral children, whose rock-based biology made them incredibly patient, had become natural mediators when conflicts arose between more volatile species. Their slow, thoughtful communication style helped calm heated disagreements and find compromises that satisfied everyone involved. But perhaps the most remarkable development was how the human adults found themselves changed by their charges. Military veterans discovered patience they never knew they possessed, while academics learned to communicate complex ideas through play and storytelling. Former engineer Bob Lewis had spent 30 years building starship engines, but he found greater satisfaction teaching young architects how to create stable crystal matrices through games that looked like elaborate construction projects. The crystalline children's natural ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level had initially intimidated him, but their enthusiasm for learning had gradually won him over. The isolation from human civilization weighed heavily on all the volunteers, especially during quiet moments when they wondered if their families back on Earth were safe. Communications with the outside galaxy were severely restricted to prevent the Ravagers from tracking their transmissions, leaving them to hope that their sacrifice would prove worthwhile. Yet despite the loneliness and constant danger, none of the volunteers expressed regret about their decision. They had created something beautiful in these hidden schools, a demonstration that different forms of life could coexist and thrive together if given the chance. Dr. Wilson often stood in her office during the evening hours, watching through her window as children from across the galaxy played together in the twilight. Their laughter translated easily across species lines, creating a symphony of joy that reminded her why they had all volunteered for this impossible mission. The monthly report sent to Earth via heavily encrypted quantum channels told only part of the story. Statistics about educational progress and facility maintenance couldn't capture the profound transformation occurring in both the human volunteers and their alien charges. What they were witnessing was the birth of something entirely new in galactic history, a generation of beings who saw species differences as interesting variations rather than barriers to overcome. These children were growing up with perspectives that their parents' generations could never fully understand. The human volunteers had committed themselves to protecting these young minds until they reached maturity, knowing full well that the Ravagers would eventually discover their locations. But as they watched their charges develop into remarkable individuals who combined the best traits of their respective species with lessons in cooperation learned from their human guardians, they began to believe that their sacrifice might actually change the galaxy forever. Late at night, when the alien children slept in their specially designed dormitories, the human staff members would gather to share stories and concerns. They all understood that their time was limited, that eventually the Ravagers would track them down despite all their precautions, but they also understood something that the Galactic Council had missed in all their strategic planning. The true victory wouldn't come from military engagement with the Ravagers. It would come from proving that different species could choose to protect and nurture each other, instead of competing for survival. In these hidden schools scattered across 13 worlds, humanity was conducting an experiment that would either validate their faith in cooperation or mark the end of their brief participation in galactic civilization. Either way, they had already succeeded in ways that no military victory could ever match. The proximity alarms began screaming at 0347 hours, jolting Commander Eric Stone from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. His feet hit the cold floor of his quarters on Kepler 7 as emergency lights bathed everything in blood-red shadows that seemed somehow prophetic through his window. He could see them descending through the planet's atmosphere like a plague of mechanical locusts, their bioships pulsing with organic light that made his skin crawl. The Ravagers had finally found them after 18 months of hiding. Stone grabbed his communication device and activated the colony-wide emergency protocol, his voice somehow remaining steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. All staff to emergency positions, initiate lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill. The colony's 200 human defenders had trained for this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of facing an enemy that had already consumed dozens of civilizations. Through intercepted transmissions during their approach, the colonists had learned the full horror of what they faced. The Ravagers didn't simply kill their prey quickly. They kept juvenile victims alive during the consumption process, slowly absorbing their developing neural patterns while the young minds remained conscious and aware. Each absorbed intelligence made the Ravagers smarter, more cunning, better, able to hunt their next victims. Dr. Wilson burst into the command center, her usually calm demeanor cracking as she reported the status of their charges. 312 children secured in the deep bunkers, all life support systems functioning. How long do we have? Stone consulted his tactical displays, watching as the enemy ships established orbital positions that effectively surrounded the planet. Best estimate is 6 hours before they begin ground operations, maybe less if they decide to bombard from orbit first. But the Ravagers had never been known to destroy potential prey through orbital strikes. They preferred to hunt their victims personally, savoring the terror and desperation that made the neural absorption process more effective. This psychological warfare aspect had made them even more feared throughout the galaxy. The human volunteers had spent months preparing defensive positions throughout the colony's perimeter, using every piece of military knowledge and engineering skill they possessed. Trenches, bunkers, improvised explosive devices, and carefully planned kill zones surrounded the main facility in concentric rings of desperate innovation. Former Marine Lisa Park checked her weapon one final time, the familiar weight of human-manufactured projectile technology feeling reassuringly solid in her hands. "At least we know our bullets work on them," she muttered to her squad. Previous encounters had confirmed that kinetic weapons could penetrate Ravager bioarmor, though their regenerative abilities made killing them extremely difficult. The first landing craft touched down just after dawn, disgorging creatures that moved with fluid grace despite their terrifying appearance. The Ravagers stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies combining aspects of insect and machine in ways that hurt to look at directly. Their hunting calls echoed across the morning air, complex vocalizations that seemed designed to inspire panic in their prey. But the human defenders had trained themselves to channel fear into focused aggression, using their species' ancient predatory instincts to overcome the psychological warfare. Stone coordinated the defense from the central bunker, tracking enemy movements on displays that showed red dots spreading across the colony like an infection. First perimeter breached at sectors 4 and 7, he reported to his team leaders. Fall back to secondary positions according to plan. The humans had designed their defense in depth, trading space for time while channeling the Ravagers into carefully prepared ambush zones. Each fallback position had been pre-sighted for explosives and crossfire, turning their retreat into a series of deadly traps. Sergeant Dan Cooper triggered the first major explosive charge when a group of Ravagers entered the school's main courtyard, the blast sending alien body parts flying in every direction. But within minutes he watched in horror as the scattered pieces began reassembling themselves into new, smaller creatures. They can regenerate from partial remains, he reported over the communication network, his voice tight with shock. Complete destruction seems to be the only way to stop them permanently. This intelligence changed their entire defensive strategy. Instead of trying to wound and slow the enemy, the humans focused all their efforts on complete elimination through concentrated fire and high explosive charges. Teacher-turned-sniper Mary Johnson found herself in a church tower, methodically targeting Ravager head sections with armor-piercing rounds designed to cause maximum tissue destruction. Her background in competitive shooting had given her skills she'd never expected to use in defense of alien children. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, with human defenders falling back through predetermined positions while exacting a terrible cost from their attackers. Every meter of ground was contested with desperate ferocity that surprised even the Ravagers, who had grown accustomed to prey species that fled in panic. By the 4th day, only 53 humans remained alive, gathered in the final defensive position around the bunker entrances that led to the hidden children. They had exhausted most of their ammunition and explosives, but the Ravagers had paid heavily for their advance. Stone found himself face to face with a Ravager commander, a creature whose neural augmentations told the story of countless absorbed civilizations. Your resistance has been impressive, it communicated through bioelectric fields that human brain implants could barely decode. Surrender the young ones, and we will grant your species a quick death. The response came not from Stone, but from every surviving human simultaneously. Negative. The word echoed from 43 different voices with identical determination. What followed became a legend whispered throughout the galaxy for generations. The remaining humans didn't just fight to their deaths. They fought with such ferocious desperation that even the Ravagers began to show something resembling fear. Former engineer Bill Rogers jury-rigged the colony's fusion reactor into an improvised weapon, flooding entire sections of the facility with lethal radiation that killed both attackers and defenders alike. His sacrifice eliminated 37 Ravagers, while ensuring they could never regenerate from the contaminated remains. Teacher Rebecca Lewis led the final charge with nothing but a steel crowbar and the kind of maternal fury that had protected human children for millions of years. She personally killed 4 Ravagers before succumbing to wounds that should have killed her hours earlier. The last transmission from Kepler 7 came from Dr. Wilson, speaking into her communication device as alien claws finally breached the blast doors. 312 children safe in deep bunkers. Countdown timer set for rescue operations. Tell Earth that we held the line. When Galactic Council rescue ships arrived 2 days later, they found a scene that would haunt xenobiologists. For centuries, every human defender lay dead among the scattered remains of over 200 Ravagers, their bodies telling a story of sacrifice that defied every model of evolutionary behavior. But in the deepest bunkers, behind blast doors sealed with dying breath and determination. They found all 312 alien children alive and unharmed. The humans had literally died to the last person, rather than allow a single young life to be taken. The Ravager assault force had been so decimated that they withdrew from the system entirely, something that had never happened in their species' recorded history. For the first time since their emergence from the outer rim, they had encountered prey that fought back with such suicidal dedication that victory became too costly to pursue. News of the Kepler-7 battle spread through the galaxy within days, carrying with it questions that challenged every species' understanding of evolutionary logic. What kind of creatures would sacrifice themselves completely for the offspring of other species, gaining nothing for their own genetic lineage? The answer would reshape galactic civilization. But that transformation began with the recognition that humanity had demonstrated something unprecedented in the cosmos: the willingness to choose certain death over the failure to protect the innocent, regardless of species barriers or evolutionary advantage. The holographic recordings from Kepler-7 played continuously in the great museums of every major world, drawing crowds of beings who stood in stunned silence as they watched the final moments of the human defense. The images showed creatures who had evolved from persistence hunters choosing to become persistence protectors, dying one by one rather than abandon their alien charges. Dear Elizabeth Carter coordinated the remaining 12 colonies from her command center aboard the orbital station Phoenix, monitoring constant streams of data while trying to process the profound change occurring throughout galactic civilization. The news from Kepler-7 had triggered something unprecedented in the million-year history of the Galactic Council. The first time since their crystalline species had achieved consciousness. The architects were volunteering adult members for dangerous duty. Their delegation arrived at Phoenix Station with an announcement that sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. "We wish to contribute personnel to the Guardian Protocol," their collective representative announced, the harmonic resonance of their crystalline matrix conveying emotions that their species had rarely displayed. "The human sacrifice has demonstrated principles that transcend individual species survival." The scholar delegation followed within days, their telepathic network buzzing with unprecedented activity as mature minds volunteered for assignments that had previously been deemed impossible. These beings who had spent centuries accumulating knowledge were suddenly willing to risk everything to protect children they had never met. Dr. Carter found herself managing an influx of alien volunteers that strained the colony's infrastructure. The defenders sent their most experienced warriors. The depth dwellers provided engineers who could work in impossible conditions, and even the energy-based luminants began manifesting physical forms to assist with childcare. But something troubling emerged as these volunteers began working alongside the remaining humans. When faced with actual life-or-death situations, the alien personnel consistently made different choices than their human counterparts. The first test came when Ravager scouts discovered the colony on Tau Ceti Prime. As the evacuation alarm sounded, Dr. Carter watched through security monitors as the crisis unfolded. The human volunteers immediately moved to shield the children with their own bodies, while most alien volunteers focused on ensuring their own survival. First Commander Lisa Park, one of the few human survivors from the original program, filed a disturbing report after the incident. "They want to help," she wrote, "but when death becomes imminent, their survival instincts override their protective impulses. Only the humans consistently choose certain death over potential failure." This phenomenon puzzled the galaxy's greatest minds, leading to intensive research into the evolutionary factors that could produce such seemingly illogical behavior. The answer came from an unlikely source: a young xenobiologist named Dr. Michael Reed, who had been studying human evolutionary history. His research revealed that humanity had survived multiple near-extinction events throughout their development, creating selection pressures that favored extreme cooperative behavior. Unlike other intelligent species, humans had evolved in an environment where individual survival was impossible without group protection. Every other species achieved intelligence through individual advantage, Reed explained to the assembled scientists. Humans achieved intelligence through collective survival. They literally cannot conceive of personal safety that doesn't include the safety of their group. But the human definition of group had expanded far beyond species boundaries, encompassing any being they perceived as vulnerable or in need of protection. This expansion had occurred so naturally that humans themselves weren't consciously aware of their unique psychology. The implications staggered the galactic scientific community. Humanity represented the only known species that had evolved genuine altruism as a survival trait rather than a cultural development. Meanwhile, the children in the remaining colonies continued developing in ways that amazed their guardians. The young beings who had witnessed human sacrifice were growing up with perspectives that challenged every assumption about interspecies relations. A teenage centauri named Alex had begun teaching younger children about human courage, describing it as the willingness to face impossible odds for the benefit of others. His 6 arms would gesture excitedly as he explained concepts that his own species adults found difficult to comprehend. The aerial sprites, despite their insect-like appearance, had developed what they called protection swarms. When any child in the colony felt threatened or afraid, the tiny creatures would surround them in clouds of supportive presence that transcended language barriers. Young scholars were using their telepathic abilities to share human memories and emotions, creating a collective understanding of sacrifice that spread through their species' mental network like a beneficial virus. Adult scholars reported dreams filled with human experiences, changing their fundamental understanding of consciousness itself. Dr. Carter received daily reports of similar developments across all 12 remaining colonies. The children were unconsciously absorbing human values, along with their academic education, creating hybrid ethical systems that combined the best aspects of multiple civilizations. But perhaps most remarkably, they were teaching these values to each other through play and interaction. Games that had originally been designed for physical exercise had evolved into complex scenarios where children practiced protecting and supporting their friends across species lines. Former teacher Susan Park, now serving as educational coordinator, documented these developments with growing excitement. "They're not just learning to coexist," she reported. "They're learning to actively care for each other in ways their parent species never imagined possible." The transformation extended beyond emotional development. Young defenders were sharing their instinctive combat knowledge to help protect smaller species, while tiny aerial sprites were teaching larger children about precision and patience. The mineral children, with their slow but persistent communication style, had become natural counselors who helped resolve conflicts through patient mediation. Their rock-based biology gave them perspectives on time and permanence that helped other species understand the long-term consequences of their choices. These educational colonies had become laboratories for something unprecedented in galactic history: the development of truly integrated civilizations where species differences were seen as complementary strengths rather than barriers to overcome back on Earth. The families of the Guardian Protocol volunteers watched news broadcasts that showed their sacrifice relatives had achieved something beyond military victory. They had demonstrated that conscious choice could overcome evolutionary programming, that intelligence could choose cooperation over competition even at the ultimate cost. The Ravagers, meanwhile, had begun avoiding sectors where human colonies were suspected to exist. Their own intelligence network had analyzed the Kepler-7 battle and concluded that the cost of fighting humans who protected young exceeded the benefit of absorbing juvenile minds. For the first time in their species' history, the Ravagers were experiencing something resembling doubt. They had evolved to prey on the selfish survival instincts that governed most intelligent species, but humans represented something entirely outside their understanding. As reports continued flowing in from the remaining colonies, Dr. Carter began to realize that humanity had accidentally discovered the key to galactic transformation, not through superior technology or military might, but through the simple act of demonstrating that different species could choose to protect each other unconditionally. The word was spreading through diplomatic channels, trade networks, and communication arrays. Humanity had proven that evolution's greatest achievement wasn't intelligence or technology, but the capacity for conscious beings to transcend their own survival instincts in service of others. This realization would reshape everything the galaxy thought it knew about civilization, cooperation, and the possibilities for interspecies development. But first, it would lead to the greatest test humanity had ever faced. The ultimatum arrived simultaneously across every human communication network in the galaxy, broadcast on frequencies that penetrated even the most secure military channels. The Ravager collective consciousness spoke with a voice that carried the absorbed intelligence of countless consumed civilizations, humans of the Guardian Protocol. The transmission began, each word dripping with predatory confidence. "You have caused us unprecedented difficulty in our harvesting operations. This ends now." Admiral Hayes stood in Earth's primary defense center, watching tactical displays that showed Ravager fleet movements converging on the Sol system like a closing fist. Over 3,000 bioships had emerged from hyperspace at the system's edge, their organic hulls pulsing with the accumulated power of devoured worlds. "We offer a simple exchange," the Ravager message continued. "Surrender the locations of all hidden colonies and their protected juveniles, and we will grant your homeworld a quick destruction. Refuse, and we will consume your population slowly, while your children watch from across the galaxy." The response came not from Earth's government or military command, but from every human volunteer serving in the Guardian Protocol simultaneously. 12 different colonies, scattered across uncharted worlds, transmitted the same two words at exactly the same moment. Negative, denied. Captain Anna Mills, now serving as field commander for the colony on Kepler 219b, barely glanced up from her maintenance work as she made the transmission. Around her, 370 alien children from 51 different species continued their daily lessons, protected by a garrison of 134 human volunteers who had never seriously considered any other choice. The Ravagers had expected this response, having studied human psychology extensively since the Kepler 7 incident. Their strategy reflected this understanding. Instead of attacking the hidden colonies directly, they would force humanity to watch Earth's destruction while knowing that surrender could save their homeworld, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human attachment. These volunteers hadn't abandoned their homeworld out of indifference. They had left Earth precisely because they loved it enough to ensure that its values would survive, even if the planet itself did not. The first phase of the assault began within hours, as Ravager forces engaged Earth's defense fleets in a series of brutal exchanges that lit up the outer solar system. Humanity's crude kinetic weapons and fusion missiles proved effective against bioship armor, but the technological gap remained enormous. Fleet Admiral Torres watched her formations being systematically dismantled, each lost ship representing hundreds of trained personnel who would never see their families again. But her orders were explicit: hold the line as long as possible while the Guardian colonies completed their mission. The hidden truth was that the colonies had been preparing for this moment since their inception. Every human volunteer understood that their ultimate purpose wasn't just to protect alien children until the Ravager threat passed, but to ensure that these young beings reached full maturity with a complete education in human values. Dr. Elizabeth Carter coordinated the final phase of the Guardian Protocol from her command center, monitoring 12 different worlds where human volunteers were racing against time. They had approximately 72 hours before Earth's defenses would be completely overwhelmed. On Tau Ceti Prime, former engineer Bob Lewis was teaching young architects how to create crystalline matrices that could store human memories and experiences. His students worked with focused intensity, understanding that they were preserving something irreplaceable for future generations. The aerial sprites on Kepler 442c were learning to encode human stories into the complex flight patterns that their species used for cultural transmission. Teacher Mary Johnson watched with tears in her eyes as tiny beings no larger than hummingbirds carefully practiced aerial dances that would carry humanity's legacy across the galaxy. Perhaps most remarkably, the children themselves had begun to understand what was happening. These young beings who had grown up under human protection were consciously choosing to carry forward the values they had learned, even knowing the cost. A teenage scholar named Sam had established a telepathic network linking all the colonies, allowing children from different worlds to share experiences and coordinate their efforts. Through this connection, they were creating something unprecedented, a collective consciousness dedicated to preserving and spreading human ethical principles. Dr. Wilson's replacement on the Forest Moon, former soldier Lisa Park, found herself surrounded by alien children who insisted on learning human military tactics, not for conquest or aggression, but to understand how humans had developed the courage to face impossible odds for the sake of others. "We want to be like you," explained a young defender, his powerful frame still awkward with adolescence. "We want to be the kind of beings who protect instead of just surviving." The battles raging around Earth grew increasingly desperate as human fleet formations sacrificed themselves to buy additional time for the colonies. Admiral Hayes watched, her forces being consumed ship by ship, but the tactical displays also showed something the Ravagers hadn't anticipated. Other species were arriving to assist in Earth's defense. The architects had sent their most powerful vessels. The scholars were providing tactical intelligence through telepathic networks, and even the usually peaceful luminants were manifesting as weapons of devastating energy. But these alien reinforcements fought with calculated precision, preserving their own forces while providing support. Only the human ships consistently chose certain destruction over tactical retreat, ramming damaged vessels into Ravager formations even when escape remained possible. The end came on the 13th day of battle, as the last human colony transmitted its final report. Every Guardian Protocol volunteer had died at their post, but not before ensuring that over 4,000 alien children had received complete educations in human history, philosophy, and ethics. Captain Mills's final message was typical of the breed. All charges safe and educated. They know who they are and who they want to become. Mission accomplished. The Ravager victory should have been total, but something unprecedented occurred in the aftermath. The surviving alien children now, reaching maturity with human values deeply embedded in their consciousness, began making choices that defied their own species' evolutionary programming. Young architects used their molecular manipulation abilities to create memorial structures that would preserve human memory for millions of years. Scholar adolescents established permanent telepathic archives containing every human story, song, and philosophical insight they could gather. The defenders organized their first interspecies protection corps, dedicating their lives to safeguarding the vulnerable across all species boundaries. Their warrior culture had been transformed by human example into something that prioritized protection over conquest. Most significantly, these matured aliens began working together with unprecedented cooperation. The competitive instincts that had historically separated galactic civilizations were being overridden by consciously chosen human values of mutual support and sacrifice. The Ravagers found themselves facing something they had never encountered before: prey that fought back not just individually, but collectively across species lines. Young Centauri worked with aerial sprites to create early warning networks, while Scholar-Defender partnerships developed new tactical approaches that combined telepathic coordination with warrior skills. Within 5 years of Earth's fall, the transformed generation had accomplished what millions of years of separate evolution had failed to achieve. They created the first truly unified galactic civilization, bound together not by conquest or trade agreements, but by shared commitment to protecting each other. The Ravagers' hunting efficiency plummeted as their prey species stopped fleeing in panic and began organizing coordinated resistance. Worlds that had previously fallen within days now held out for months, their defenders inspired by stories of human sacrifice and trained in tactics that prioritized group survival over individual escape. Former Ravager hunting grounds became battlefields where young beings from dozens of species fought with human-inspired determination. They sang human songs as they charged into combat, carried human names alongside their birth designations, and died with human words on their lips. But the greatest transformation occurred when captured. Ravagers began experiencing something their species had never known: doubt about their fundamental nature. The absorbed neural patterns of human-educated, aliens carried concepts that infected the collective consciousness like a beneficial virus. For the first time in their evolutionary history, Individual ravagers began questioning whether consumption of intelligence was truly necessary for their species' survival. Some even began refusing to participate in hunting expeditions, creating internal conflicts that weakened their collective effectiveness. The war's turning point came when a group of young scholars successfully established telepathic contact with isolated ravagers, sharing human memories and emotions directly through mental connection. The experience of feeling genuine altruism for the first time shattered the psychological foundations that had driven Ravager society for millennia. Within a decade, the Ravager threat had essentially collapsed from internal contradiction. A species built on consuming others' intelligence could not survive exposure to a mindset that valued others' welfare above personal gain. The memorial to humanity's sacrifice became the most visited site in galactic space, but it was not built from stone or metal. Instead, the surviving species created a living monument, a new galactic council dedicated to protecting and nurturing young life across all species boundaries. Every important decision was made using a simple test inspired by human example. Would this choice protect the vulnerable even at cost to ourselves? The question had become the foundation of galactic law, ethics, and social organization. Children from every species learned human history as a core requirement, studying the Guardian Protocol not as ancient history, but as a guide for daily behavior. Human concepts like honor, sacrifice, and unconditional protection became universal values that transcended species boundaries. The transformation was so complete that within 50 years, most galactic citizens couldn't imagine civilization operating any other way. The idea that intelligent beings might prioritize their own survival over protecting others had become as alien as the humans who had first demonstrated the alternative. Dr. Carter's final report, transmitted moments before her death, had predicted this outcome. "We're not just protecting children," she had written. "We're planting seeds of human values in the next generation of galactic leadership. If even a few of them remember what we've taught them, everything changes." She had been more right than she could have imagined. The children who survived, the Guardian Protocol didn't just remember human lessons. They made those lessons the defining characteristics of mature galactic civilization. The irony was profound. Humanity's extinction had resulted in the entire galaxy becoming more human than it had ever been. Their values lived on in beings whose evolutionary history had never included such concepts, proving that consciousness could choose its own development path regardless of biological programming. On worlds across the galaxy, monuments bore the same inscription in every known language. They volunteered first, died last, and asked for nothing in return. In their memory, we choose to be better than evolution made us. The human experiment had succeeded beyond every possible expectation. They had demonstrated that intelligence's greatest achievement wasn't surviving or conquering, but choosing to protect others even unto death. In the end, humanity's brief participation in galactic civilization had lasted only a few centuries, but their influence would reshape the cosmos for millions of years to come. They had proven that love was stronger than evolution, that choice could overcome instinct, and that the greatest victory was not living forever, but living in a way that made forever worth having. The galaxy would never forget the species that had volunteered to save everyone's children, transforming the entire meaning of what it meant to be truly intelligent.